Good evening. Once again, Ann has called to the bullpen for the left-hander. Starting to feel more like a starter than a reliever. Anyway, that being said, my name is Kevin Barry, and I'm happy to be here to introduce tonight's speaker. We start off first with some upcoming Tales of Cape Cod guest speakers and events of interest. Our next speaker will be Thursday, 10 August, Dr. Robert Martello, professor at Allen College. He will explore Paul Revere's entrepreneurial contribution to the country, a form of patriotism that took place in workshops and factories. We'll also have a tribute to our own James Otis Ellis, a beloved member of this community and Tales of Cape Cod. The following Monday, we will host Dr. Daphne Palmer Giannakalopoulos, or the proper Greek pronunciation would be Dr. Daphne Palmer Giannakalopoulos. She is a local author of The Pirate's Wife, the remarkable true story of Sarah Kidd. Now that the commercial announcements are done, I would like to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Ms. Deborah J. Swiss is an accomplished author, speaker, and consultant with a specialty in women's history, gender equality, and work-life balance. Her book, The Tin Ticket, on sale over there, on which tonight's talk is based, won Runners-Up Award honors in 2011 for Best Nonfiction Book, awarded by the American Society of Journalists and Authors, and was selected by Reader's Digest Australia and New Zealand for their 2012 Encounter series. The Tin Ticket is now being made into a television series by Midnight Madhouse Production. Ms. Swiss has appeared on the Today Show in the US and on ABC Radio across Australia. She holds a master's degree and doctorate from Harvard University, and her BA was from Bowdoin College. Her work has received attention in many publications, including Time and Fortune magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, and the Federal Glass Ceiling Commission report. We're also pleased to have with us this evening singer-songwriter Digny Fignis, who will play All for Love, an original song he wrote to honor the women in the Tin Ticket, who will perform at the end of Mrs. Swiss' presentation and prior to Q&As. Tonight's sponsors are Lynn and Steve Heslinger, Melissa and Peter Brown, and Diane Mahoney. Please join me in recognizing and thanking tonight's sponsors. I know you don't need to be told, but cell phones to silent or off, please. Without further delay, please let's give a warm Tales of Cape Cod welcome to Miss Deborah J. Swiss.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Tales of Cape Cod, and a special thank you to one of the best bookstores on the planet, Titcomb's, which supports me and so many other authors and has copies of the Tin Ticket if you're looking for a future gift. And we moved to the Cape 9 years ago, and one of the many things we love about living here as a writer and musician is the support for the arts. So thank you all for coming out. So one of the best things that can happen to a writer is when a story finds you, and that's what happened to me with the Tin Ticket. In 2004, I went to Tasmania on assignment to write an environmental article as a way to fund my trip. And to write the article, I realized I had to sign up to do the 80-kilometer overland trail in Tasmania. Have any of you done that? Well, I barely lived to tell the tale. So I met the writing credentials, but there was something that in order to, if you're a solo woman, you have to go in a group. And they said, "Are you an expert hiker?" I know those of you who know me laugh out loud. I am not, but I thought this misdirected notion that if I went to the White Mountains 5 or 6 weekends in a row, I'd become an expert hiker. So I arrive in Tasmania in January, and it's their summer, the seasons are reversed, and they assigned me with 7 women who had just scaled the peaks of New Zealand. And I thought, what have I done? But I had to complete the trek because I wouldn't get paid, and you can only hike the Overland Trail one way for environmental reasons. So the very first day, there were hailstorms and lightning strikes. And this, if you can believe it, I look at this in horror. Those are the peaks I actually scaled. And I grant you, some of them I had to go down sitting on my seat the whole way down to get me down. So I somehow managed to survive the 8 days on the trek. And the Australians I know some of you have met Aussies, they're so kind, they like Americans. They took pity upon the crazy American who came in 4, 5, 6 hours after everyone else to the environmentally sound huts where we slept. And I was so happy after completing this trek that I didn't, die or seriously injure myself. I limped into a little post office in Launceston, Tasmania. And I wanted to mail postcards to my 2 children to let them know that their crazy mom had survived. And standing in line, someone heard me talking, and she turned around and said, "You have an American accent. Where are you from?" And I said, "Massachusetts." And without knowing I'm a writer, the person in line that day, Christina Henry, Henri, said to me, "I want to tell you a story about the 25,000 women who were transported as tamers and breeders to Australia." And I thought, wait, her artwork honors these women. Why didn't I know about this? And so we stood in line for 40 minutes in the little post office. And the interesting part of this story is Christina doesn't live in Launceston. She lives 2.5 hours away in Hobart and happened to be passing through in that 10-minute increment. Yeah. She still doesn't know why she turned around. And throughout our 40-minute conversation, I learned that from 1788 to 1868, the British government shipped 162,000 women, men, and children from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to Australia to populate the colony. They wanted to beat the French because Australia was very rich in timber and flax. So the first thing that they did was to transport the convict men who have until recently been much maligned in history. Most of the men who were transported stole coins or a goose or a duck to feed their family. They were desperately poor people trying to survive. Less than 2% of the men were violent felons. So the men were shipped first to perform hard labor in the colony of Australia, and men outnumbered women 9-1. So the British government decided they would put ads in London newspapers looking for women to go at their own expense to the other side of the world, but you'd be guaranteed to find a husband. Nobody signed up. So, how do they target the women? So, to essentially labor traffic 162,000 of their own citizens, the British government relied on a law called the Transportation Act that was enacted in the late 1700s. It was supposed to be a humane alternative to the death sentence. In the 1780, if you were a little boy and you stole a loaf of bread, you were hanged in a public spectacle in London. So the Transportation Act said if you commit any crime, petty theft, you can be sentenced to any colony, in this case, Australia. So they used that to essentially target 25,000 girls and women as tamers and breeders. I know, it's horrifying. So if you were a working class girl in Dublin or London in the 1800s, there were no jobs for women. There were rare jobs. And if you found a job, you made 30% of what a man made. And so at age 12, which was the age of adulthood, a girl on the streets of London or Dublin could either be a prostitute, which was not a crime, or she could steal food or clothing to live another day. And over the course of the 6.5 years it took me to research the tin ticket, I asked myself many times, what choice would I make? And I decided to, when you say 25,000 girls and women transported to the other side of the world, it's very easy to get lost in the numbers and forget the humanity or the inhumanity in this case. So I wrote, because the convict maids were very well documented, I chose 3 women to write about, and I wrote their descendants. And I said, hi, I'm Deborah Swiss. I'm an American author. I'd like to write about your great-great-great-great-grandma. And every family said, come stay with us. So they worked with me throughout the process. So the first girls I chose were Agnes McMillan and Janet Houston. And Agnes's mom worked in a factory. Her husband had left. Marriage was a very loose concept in Victorian times. So she made 30% of what a man made. She couldn't barely support herself. So at age 12, little Agnes found herself on the streets of Glasgow. There she ran into the person who would become her best friend, a year older, Janet Houston. And these 2 young girls made a mistake on a cold Glasgow day. They stole some stockings. And for that, they received 7 years hard labor and exile for life in Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land. So clearly the scope of the punishment exceeded the scope of the crime. And then the third woman I chose to write about was a woman named Ludlow Tedder. And she was unusual in that she was actually illiterate. She had come from the country, and people who lived in the country, because they attended churches, they were more likely to be able to read and write than those who lived in the city. And she worked as a maid for a London barrister, of course making 30% of what a man made. And she made the mistake of stealing 11 spoons in a bread basket because she wanted to send her youngest daughter, Arabella, to a poor school so she could learn how to read and write. And Ludlow received 10 years hard labor, transport with Arabella. And you might ask, why 10 years rather than 7? Well, poor Ludlow had the unfortunate luck of being sentenced at the end of the day at London Central Criminal Court. And by that time, the jurors and the judges were very drunk, and they would give out the harshest sentence. So she received 10 years hard labor and exile for life with her daughter, Arabella. And just to let you know that the story does have a happy ending, this is a picture of Ludlow Tedder's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, Keely Milliken, and dressed up in period costume at about the same age that Agnes and Janet were transported. So because the sad part about the convict maids being property of the Crown was that they were tracked like dogs. They received numbered tin tickets around their neck on a red cord in Newgate Jail, and their name was taken away, and they were tracked every step of the way. But from a researcher's point of view, it was a treasure trove. Let's see. This is a description list of Ludlow Tedder that was typical of all the women. And what's interesting about this description list is that her descendants sent this description into a forensic artist by email. They never met the guy. And he came back with this artist's rendition of Ludlow. And I think it's pretty accurate because when Ludlow's descendants picked us up at the Melbourne airport, you're supposed to say Melbourne, not Melbourne, Melbourne airport in Australia, we knew who they were because they had the same nose and the same chin we could see from across the way. Yeah, so I think it's pretty accurate. It's a way of making history come alive. And because they were very well documented, I don't expect you to read this next. Whoops. This is the Scottish record for Agnes and Janet, very detailed. And Janet had bright red hair, so she was always the first to get arrested. They knew her. And she was a surrogate big sister and protector for little Agnes. And I read in their convict list that the two girls stole stockings from a shop known as Rankin's. And little naive Agnes left the tag on them, and a constable noticed the tag hanging below her dress. And I know that they were arrested in Kilmarnock Cross. And many times over the course of 6.5 years, I would do a Google image search, look for town records. I couldn't find anything. And then one night, about 2 in the morning, which is when a lot of my writing got done and research, I found this, see if I can do this image from the 1800s of Kilmarnock Cross in Scotland. And you can see there's a shop known as Rankin's there. Like, voila. So then I was able to go to the town records and find that sure enough, Rankin's stole stockings. So we know it came. And just a way to make history come alive, that these two desperate young girls stole stockings because they were cold and they really had no other choice. So as I was writing, the tin ticket, one of the things that really infuriated me is that I kept reading in London newspapers at the time that poverty is a crime. If you were born poor, it's your fault. And that just made me just go a little crazy. It's just like, ugh. And I thought, what's the context of the time? And the context of the times was, the upper crust in London wanted to dispose of the unsightly poor. That was another reason to transport them to the other side of the world. And in the monarchy, you had mad King George III, who literally was insane, running naked through the palace as his dresser chased him. They now think he might have been poisoned from arsenic in his wig or had some kind of a mental illness. Then you had his successor, King George IV, who was a known bigamist and a suspected murderer. And this so infuriated Queen Caroline that she was known to walk through the palace in her negligee having affairs with her servants. And these were the elite. And yet they're shipping little girls for stealing stockings and a mom with her 9-year-old. And then I calmed myself down and I thought, I don't think anyone wants to read an angry book. And I certainly write them. So I asked myself, did anyone in the world speak out about this injustice? Say that this is wrong? And I'm delighted to say one person did. Elizabeth Gurney Fry. And Elizabeth Gurney Fry was a Quaker minister and mother of 11, and Quakers tend to be the progressives of the day. And I can show you this. I found in a used bookstore in the UK online a copy of the diary from 1893 put together by her daughters. And I credit Mrs. Fry with many things. One is, this is where I first read about the numbered tin tickets put around the girls' necks in Newgate Jail to try to bring some order to a very chaotic system. So I thank her for the title. And I also thank her because she gave me permission to view the convict maids through a lens of compassion, which is kind of a non-traditional way to write history. But having met with the descendants, I was determined to get their story right and to tell the truth about what really happened to them. So according to Mrs. Fry's diary, she talks about one night, as she was sitting by her fireplace, Stephen Grillet, who was a Quaker reformer, came knocking at her door and said, "Mrs. Fry, I've been to Newgate Jail today. I've been to the men's wards, and it's pretty bad, but I went to the women's ward, and it's infinitely worse. Please go take a look." Because felons, the mentally ill babies, were imprisoned with girls like Agnes and Janet, and Ludlow and her daughter Arabella. So at this point, Mrs. Fry was more famous than Queen Victoria. Everyone knew who she was. She was known, she had soup kitchens on the steps of her home. She taught Bible school so people could learn how to read on Sundays. She was the first woman to testify before Parliament about prison reform, far ahead of her time. But what I love about her diary, she talks about she and her best friend, Anna Buxton, who you can see cowering, went to Newgate Jail. And according to her diary, the rather diminutive turnkey said, "Mrs. Fry, don't go in. These evil creatures will tear you limb from limb. They'll steal your jewelry." And she just pushed the little guy away. And she talks about she walked in, she could hear the big door slam and lock behind her. And she looked in the room and saw 300 pairs of eyes staring at her, the dark, damp, musty cell. And I was able to find the outline for Newgate Jail at the time, which no longer exists in London. And each person had a physical space of 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet to live, eat, dispose of bodily functions. So you can just imagine the conditions. So Mrs. Fry talked about it took for a few moments for her eyes to adjust. But she looked across the room and she noticed that there was a mom cradling a baby who was crying. And with her 8 layers, you can see all her skirts, her jewelry and finery. And she was known for wearing purple boots with scarlet laces, so a tad bit eccentric. She trudged through the muck and the mud across to the mom and the baby. And she started touching the baby. And the room fell to silence because for an upper-crust woman like Mrs. Fry, to even talk to the poor was unheard of. For her to be touching a baby so kindly, just people couldn't speak. They were silent. So she took advantage of this moment, rare moment of silence in Newgate Jail, to ask the girls and women awaiting transport a question no one had ever asked them before. And it was simply, "What dost thou need?" And it's a question that I think is really beautiful in its dignity and its simplicity. And the girls and women immediately started saying, "Well, we'd love to have clothes, clean clothes for our babies and our children." So that night, Mrs. Fry and an army of Quaker volunteers by candlelight started sewing baby clothes and clothes for their children. And for 35 years, she and her volunteers met with about half. They met with about 12,500 of the women who were transported. They would come into Newgate Jail and teach them skills. They would teach them how to read and write, and their children how to read and write. And before they were transported on the convict ships, which were converted slave ships, terrible conditions. The girls were just above the bilge. The animals they kept on the top deck because they wanted to keep them alive. And the girls were on a board 18 inches across below deck, just above the bilge. And Mrs. Fry wanted to give the convict maids something to do on the long sea voyage. So she and her volunteers put together a sewing packet with scraps of cloths, a needle and a thread, and she even tucked a comb into the bag so the girls could have a bit of dignity. And the convict maids aboard ship would sew these beautiful quilts that they could then sell in Australia and use in the underground prison economy to buy some things like soap or some extra food. And there's one quilt that's known to have survived called the Raja quilt. And if you want to see what it actually looks like, you can go to the National Museum of Australia, which is Canberra. And in another moment of serendipity for me, I was giving a radio talk in Canberra, and I was raving about how Mrs. Fry is one of my heroes. And the person interviewing said to me, "Deborah, are you aware that the Raja quilt, which only comes out once a year because it's so fragile, is on exhibit today?" So Dick and I raced over to the museum, and it's so delicate you're not allowed to take pictures of it. So this is a picture of a postcard. It's 8 feet by 11 feet. It's huge. And Raja was the name of one of the convict ships. And what was interesting to me is that you could see when you saw the stitching, you could see that there were some blood stains from inexperienced fingers. But below deck, these convict maids who were being shipped to the other side of the world, which would be like going to Mars today, were making this beautiful piece of artwork. And On the other side of the Raja quilt was an inscription. They probably, on some of the convict ships, they had volunteers for Mrs. Fry come along and see what the conditions were like and support the girls and women. And someone who was literate clearly did this, but they spelled Van Diemen's Land incorrectly. But if you go to the museum, you can see it's a piece of artwork, and they're now trying to get funding to do forensic analysis of whose fingerprints, whose blood stains are on the quilt, who actually sewed it. So hopefully that will happen. And the other thing Mrs. Fry did was she would often meet with the girls and women the night before they were transported. And of course, they were very fearful. Most of the girls had never even been on a rowboat, and they knew no women ever came back from Australia. So she started meeting with the women and promised that she would stay in touch with them. She would write the people for whom they would become indentured servants. She would send volunteers aboard the ship, and indeed she came through with all those promises. And she noticed that after a while, when she and her volunteers started meeting with the girls and women the night before they were transported, they were calmer. She gave them a little bit of hope. And she also noticed that in the underground prison economy, the girls were giving convict love tokens to the people they were saying their goodbyes to on the docks of London or Dublin. They would smooth off a penny or a halfpenny, or there was a bustling prison economy where some people became real experts on how to do elaborate designs and names on the convict love tokens. And in the 1980s, a coin collector, Tim Millett, found a lot of these love tokens. A lot of them were preserved in the Thames because they were very sturdy, or copper, or found in estate sales. And, whoops. Get to the love token, whoops. That's at the end. So I mentioned the love tokens because when you think about the injustice that Agnes, Janet, and Ludlow suffered, being sent to the other side of the world, hard labor, exile for life, for crimes of poverty, and they simply wanted to be remembered. And when I was caring for my mom with Alzheimer's and was up at all kinds of crazy hours so she wouldn't escape, I would go to eBay UK and look for these love tokens. And if you go to the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, they show some of the incredible artwork on the more detailed ones that are out of my budget. But afterwards I can show you, this one is on a penny, and it just has 2 hearts on it. Someone wanted to be remembered. And this one is a halfpenny. And I especially like this one because somebody must have just used like a nail or something and wrote an M, and then in a hurry given it to a loved one on the docks because they wanted to be remembered. And I tell you this because I was talking to some of you earlier, the convict men and women have been much maligned, that there were these evil people doing terrible deeds. They were desperately poor, and they were also human. So once they're aboard the convict ship, a 4 to 6 month sea journey, they were sent to the Cascades Female Factory, which was a converted distillery. And there they awaited assignment to local settlers. So at any given time, there were about 300 girls and women there at a time. And I noticed that when Agnes and Janet arrived, there was a hurricane. Even the birds had left the island. And you think about these 2 little girls getting off the converted slave ship, and poor Agnes was sick the whole journey because she had seasick, and they would treat her with things like bloodletting. So the cures were worse than her illness. And I was able to find the newspapers of the day that described the hurricane in which they arrived. They're barefoot, and they're walking in scratchy shifts. They're cold. And I was thinking about the fact that it was a long walk from the docks to the converted distillery, and along the way they were probably seeing echidna, they're seeing wallaby, maybe kangaroos. and thinking these little street urchins must have been thinking, geez, these are the biggest rats I've ever seen. So these are the walls of the Cascades Female Factory, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And these are the stone wash tubs. There's one left where they were required to scrub laundry. And one of the things I learned in working with Ludlow's descendants is that Arabella, her 9-year-old, was taken away from her and brought to an orphanage when she first went to Cascades. And the orphanage sent its laundry to be done by the women at Cascades, so she was probably doing laundry for her daughter. But I will have to say, Ludlow was very clever. Because she could read and write, she was able to save money, and when she received her ticket of leave for freedom, she was able to buy Arabella back from the orphanage. Very clever person. And this is the window of Cascades. It's about 12 inches across. And I gave a talk there one night, and I was thinking, you know, the darkness, and it was cold, and it was damp. It was built in essentially a riverbed, so it was wet all the time. How did they survive? So I have to say, I ended up with kind of a non-traditional research question, which was, how do people go through the worst things you can imagine and emerge as loving human beings? What enables the human spirit to triumph over tragedy? And how did they find hope when really none had the right to exist? I mean, at the Cascades Female Factory, they were eating watery ox head soup every day for years. I actually found the recipe in the newspaper, and it's disgusting. How did they survive? So, I don't have all the answers to these lofty questions, but I just want to give you a few of my favorite examples of the resiliency and their survival skills and tenacity of the convict maids. First, they were really ingenious and creative. One of the things that Mrs. Fry did when she gave the girls a sewing packet was to also give them a Bible. Now, this was a lovely thought, except the majority of the girls couldn't read it. But I read in the diary of a minister who was aboard one of the convict ships that he noticed that the women were putting the good book to good use. They were tearing up pages to make playing cards and have a bit of fun below deck. And what really touched my heart is that they were using pages from the Bible to make curling papers for their hair. So these girls, they're skinny, they're pockmarked, they're seasick. One woman I wrote about was missing an eye, but they're daring to be beautiful. They're daring to be alive. They're curling their hair below deck. And once they were freed, the vast majority of the men and women went to New South Wales where they could make up a story about their past, and they could hide their past and have a fresh start. So Agnes, like many of the convicts, went with her husband to the gold fields in New South Wales. And it was like the Wild West with all these marauding bandits. And in a very obscure little library that I dragged her descendants to in the middle of nowhere, I found a file with the obituary of one of her children, and it talked about when they crossed the gold fields, they were safe from having their gold stolen that they found, because Agnes cleverly tucked the nuggets into the nappies, the diapers of her babies, and they safely crossed the gold field. That's very smart. And probably my favorite scheme is at Cascades. The women at Cascades would often run away from their indentured servants because they'd rather be back with their friends. And it was probably, quite honestly, easier to scrub laundry rather than working out on a farm 7 days a week. And when the girls and women would go into town to do errands for the prison, they would meet the men who in many cases would become their boyfriends or their husbands, but they weren't supposed to talk. So they devised a scheme whereby when they went to pick up chickens and have them delivered, they would smuggle love letters inside the chicken. that were delivered to a corrupt warden at Cascades. And the best part of this story is the girls weren't caught. But one day a constable came to inspect the prison, and he went into the kitchen and saw stacks of chickens with notes coming out of them. So the person who was running the prison was dismissed. And, you know, I have to say, humor was one of the things that was deliberately designed to torment their captors. And in talking to descendants, they agree with me. You have to figure that since 20% of Aussies are descended from these convict women, that some of the resiliency and the spunk and the humor that has to have come from these convict men and women. And at the Cascades Female Factory, 300 women would sleep shoulder to shoulder in hammocks, dark, damp conditions. And they would put on these rowdy plays and songs and sing at the top of their lungs. And they, of course, the warden was on the other side of the yard. He'd come by with his nightcap, and he was going to chastise them, but they would time the number of his steps it would take to get to their room, and they'd stop singing all at once. He couldn't punish all 300 of them. There weren't that many solitary cells. So he'd traipse back to his cells, and they'd start singing again at the top of their lungs. And it sounds like a silly example, but you think of little teenagers like Agnes and Janet. You know, they must have been thinking, you know, you can shave my head, put me in a scratchy shift, but, you know, you're not taking away my spirit, my humor. And I read in the Hobart Town newspaper about the first female flash mob. Now, do all of you know what a flash mob is? It's usually an event, you know, maybe it's for an engagement or a party, and people dance and sing. It's a joyful event in the United States. But I think I might have found in 1840 the first reference to a flash mob. Some Australian historians think it was called flash mob because flash was the body language of convicts, flash language, and mob for a mob of kangaroos. Makes sense. But anyway, so the newspapers in Hobart Town had nothing to do but write about these wild, fiery, rebellious women. And I read about the first female flash mob. And one of their regular shenanigans was, whenever there was a full moon, they would take off their scratchy shifts that were meant to just make you miserable. And they would sing and dance naked under Mount Wellington under a full moon. Now, they couldn't get caught because the minister, who was the warden at the time, couldn't possibly look at naked women. So he didn't know who to punish. And they would do this again and again. And there were lots of examples of rebellion that among members of the flash mob. There was a woman who was notorious, Jemmy the Rover. She twice escaped over those walls that I showed you. First time, she must have tied together pieces of cloth from the laundry she was scrubbing and scaled the walls. The second time, she spooned her way out under to be with her boyfriend and went to cut timber for a few years before she was caught. And she was a hero. And the leader of the flash mob was a girl named Ellen Scott. And Ellen Scott was convicted in Limerick, Ireland at 17 for stealing a watch chain. And she had one other offense for vagrancy. And whoops. I don't know if that's not in there. And if you were Irish, you received the harshest sentence of all because there was terrible discrimination by the Irish, against the Irish. And Ellen received exile for life, a life sentence at Cascades. So just because she was Irish. So she had nothing to lose. And she would lead the flash mob. They would smuggle in gaudy jewelry and cigars, and they'd dance around, and they dared to have a little fun. And one of the stories I read about Ellen Scott was that she, she led the first female flash mob, which mooned some visiting dignitaries. And this is in maybe 4 or 5 well-known history books. What she did is to say to the women, the poor didn't wear underwear, so some visiting dignitaries are coming, and we'll just moon them. And I have to say, this little card, until recently, was sold, big stacks of it, at the Cascades Female Factory and all across Hobart. But the story didn't happen that way. It's like, oh, when I told my literary agent that I had to take out this story, I think she wept because it was such a good story. So this is why you have to go back to original sources. How could this happen? There was a mooning incident, but not 300. So how could it happen? So there was one mooning incident, and what it was Ellen was a rebel. She had nothing to lose, and every morning and every night, they were lectured by the minister about how they were evil. They'd never find reform and redemption. A woman was considered bad forever, even if she served her sentence. Once a man completed his sentence, society forgave him, not for a woman. So every morning, William Bedford, who the girls nicknamed Holy Willie, would yell at them and told them that they would never reform, they would burn in hell, every morning, every evening. And by night, this married preacher and father of 3 was abusing many of the girls. And Ellen couldn't take it. So one morning, she just pranced to the front of the chapel, lifted her skirt, and mooned him. So there was a mooning incident. But back to how did it get to this story in the book about the 300? So I tracked down the original source for the story, which was a book written about the time Ellen was there by a man who wanted the rather cushy job as the warden at Cascades. He didn't get it. And he wrote what could only be construed as a novel. A little kernel of truth he heard about the mooning incident, he made it up. But we now know it couldn't have happened because it would have been in the records of many women who mooned it. It would have been in the newspapers. They all would have been punished. And I actually tracked down this book. The only place in the country that had a copy of this very obscure book was the Harvard University Library, and it took them 2 weeks to find it for me. No one had ever taken it out before. And it was a great story, but it didn't happen. So you have to question history sometimes. So until recently, this is the solitary cells where Ellen would be sent once again after her transgressions. So until recently, the convict maids were called notorious strumpets and evil wenches. And I've drawn, a very different conclusion after getting to know them, that these women in a sisterhood of sorrow survived the worst things that you can imagine. The vast majority went on to become loving mothers and grandmothers. They not only survived, but they thrived and they prospered. And they became the founding mothers of modern Australia. And many of the women, like Agnes, migrated to New South Wales, which was the most progressive society in the world for women at the time. It was the first place in the world that women could own property, and it was the second place in the world that women can vote after New Zealand. So out of the Sisterhood of Sorrow emerged a very buoyant democracy. And the reason I call these women heroic is that I consider them ordinary women who became extraordinary because they really had no other choice. And I just want to conclude by saying that the reason they inspire me really every single day is that these girls and women faced down and defeated what could only be considered the very darkest recesses of humanity. Yet they went on to lead their lives with grace and with dignity and with forgiveness. And for that, it really exemplifies to me that they exhibit, I think, the rather magnificent capacity for nobility that I think exists within us all. So let me end there. So I want to have time for questions, but we have a brief musical interlude. It pays to fall for musician because my other half, Digny Figness, read so many drafts of the Tin Ticket over 6.5 years that one day he said, "Oh, I'm leaving the house." I thought, oh, he's going to hide. He doesn't want to come back, read any more drafts. He went to the studio to write a song about the convict love tokens that were left behind. Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes it's nice. It's funny where you get your inspirations from, and with Deborah doing all the research, and I came across this book about the love tokens, and I started to think about what it must have been like for these young women to go to Australia, a place they didn't have any idea about, and when they got there, not even the stars would be the same. So here you go, something for you called All for Love. Leave a locket of your hair, I'll take it with me everywhere. It's all for love. It's all for love. There's a shilling scribbled with my name, so even if they change the stars above, remember me, I did it all for love. All for love. If I had to do it all again, someday I'll shed my eyes, be free from all these crimes. It's all for love. It's all for love. They shave my head to bone and tear me from my happy home. Even if they change the stars above, remember me, I did it all for love. All for love. If I had to do it all again, leave a locket of your head, I'll take it with me everywhere. It's all for love. It's all for love. We may never meet again, so here's a shilling scribbled with my name. So even if they change the stars above, remember me, I did it all for love. Remember me, I did it all for love. Remember me, I did it all for love. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Digny. I have to say, the first 300 times I heard that song, and he played it at Cascades, and it was at night, and there were a lot of descendants there, and you could they were saying you could feel their ghostly presence. They must think Americans cry all the time, because every time we play it, but yeah, another way to make history come alive. So I'm happy to I was going to show you too, so this is where Agnes ended up, in the beautiful, fresh water and nice place to raise your children. And I actually forced Digny to drive me. And this was the open space. This is today, this clean, beautiful, pristine place. Through, the worst of times, I ended up in a great place. I went on to give birth to a whole long line of wonderful descendants. And this is a plaque that's at Cascades, more sinned against than sinning. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Hi.
So, if the people, go to Australia to, profit?
Did they what?
Profit?
Did they profit?
Yeah, not the criminals, but, yeah, the other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the other people, yes. So that's actually a really quick question. Did the people who go to, how did the other free settlers who go to Australia, how did they do? Yeah, because it was a new country and they could, they were starting from scratch. And I'm glad you asked that question because people say, why did transportation end in 1868? Not for any humane reasons. It ended because the free settlers noticed, free settlers who came over free, as you're talking about, from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to, this new lake of fortune, saw that the convict men and women were better workers and they didn't want to compete with them. So that's why they abolished transportation. They didn't want to compete with the hard-working convict men and women.
What percentage of the women survived?
Pardon me?
What percentage?
Oh, the good question. What percentage of the women survived there? I was surprised that there was very low mortality on the convict ships probably because these girls and women were often hungry. At least on the ships, you received one meal a day. And the other thing is that the sailors who were responsible for the crew didn't want them to die because they wouldn't get paid as much. So they had incentive for the women to live. But occasionally a woman would die or a baby would die and then there would be a burial at sea. But that was actually very rare, which is amazing that they're survivors for the conditions. But they think, historians think it's because they actually had one half-decent meal a day. Hi.
How long did the voyage take to go from Liverpool
Good
all the
question.
way over to Australia?
Yeah.
And did they stop somewhere to replenish?
No, they went around the Cape of Good Hope, ironically, 4 to 6 months. I mean, that's just, yeah. These are survivors. This is why the comics, the descendants I met are such strong, feisty people. They came from some tough stock, and they emerged as loving human beings. That's the part that it's hard to even imagine from the first phase of their journey on. Hi.
What were the years again that they were transported?
Yeah, so the years they were transported, 1788 to 1868. 162,000. Yep. But I was telling some people earlier, until, maybe 30, 40 years ago, it was considered the convict stain. And actually in Sydney, about half the convicts were shipped to Sydney and half to Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania. And the reason I chose the women transported to Tasmania is that the records are largely intact. One of the things they discovered not that long ago was that descendants were going into records in the big Sydney archives and asking for their convict records and then destroying them because they wanted to erase the convict stain. So, yeah. And for some reason there was a mysterious fire there at one point, which, who knows. But now, when I stayed with the descendants of the women I wrote about, friends would come over and their friends would come over and visit, and they'd say, "Can you find me a convict descendant?" You know, it's considered that it's an honor because these were really strong people who overcame. And that, to me, you asked about the survival rate, the vast majority of the women, once they were freed from Cascades, went on to lead good lives, to become loving mothers and grandmothers. A small number defaulted into alcoholism or mental illness, but the vast majority of them not only survived, but they thrived and they prospered. Hi.
When did Cascades close?
Pardon me?
When did Cascades actually close with all the prisoners gone?
I still couldn't hear too well. What was the question?
When did Cascades close?
Oh, yeah, so that's a good question. Cascades closed in 1868, once when transportation was ended. So,
Did they release the prisoners at that time?
yes, they received, tickets of leave. And that's when, Ludlow cleverly literally bought back Arabella. And what's interesting is once they were freed, the story, and Agnes's descendants, until this 2 generations ago, thought the story in their family was this beautiful gray-eyed girl arrived in Sydney with a wealthy sailor. That's how she came there. They didn't know this. And the reason they discovered her true story is that Edna, who's Agnes's descendant, was, when her husband retired, said, "You've got to go do something. You're driving me crazy. Go research your ancestry. Nothing interesting." Well, he started researching her ancestry and said, "Wait till you see what I found." And she was delighted. But that was the story that went around for many years. Richard?
If a child was born to a woman who was in Cascades, what happens to the child?
Yeah, the question about what happens to a baby, of course, there were many children born of rape at Cascades, and they were taken at 6 months to the orphanage. And the reason, and what's horrifying is that records of the orphanage said this was for reasons of ethnic cleansing. They wanted to take them away from their moms. So, it's how history doesn't, you don't want history to repeat itself. Hi. Yeah.
Tell us about the mini-series. Tell us about the mini-series.
Oh, yeah. So, if you're asking about the option for the tin tickets, so actually 2 Aussie actors, Alec Hanna and Jenna Rosenau, have optioned the tin ticket and for a TV series. And when they visited here last summer to go through all my research materials, we're up till 3 or 4 in the morning, they had an artist make up a tin ticket with Agnes's number on it. I know, isn't it beautiful? Yeah, and what's interesting, these 2 young women are both from Melbourne. They didn't know about the women's part of the convict history, and they were surprised, and they did a Google search, and they bought my book, and they wrote me, and they came to Cape Cod, and things, yes, they're working hard. Things are a little slower with the writer's strike, but I have a conference call with them tomorrow, and they are, they're determined to get the story right. So, fingers crossed. Absolutely. Well, they love Cape Cod. I mean, they all we did was work the whole time, but they want to come back. So, yeah. Are there any other questions?
Why was the British Isles the only ones to send prisoners here?
Pardon me?
Was the British Isles the only ones to send prisoners?
Well, at first, they did send convicts to the United States, and then it wasn't the United States, and to America. We didn't want them, but they needed free labor to beat the French, to colonize Australia. So that was essentially labor trafficking. And what this book led me to do is that I'm involved with this group some of you know about called Cape Cod Path, People Against Trafficking Humans, because this was labor trafficking, 162,000 desperately poor people, and human trafficking exists today. So it was kind of a gift to me that when I was giving a talk one day, a woman said, "You have to join this group that my sister is a member of, and to try to stop human trafficking that persists today, even, in beautiful Cape Cod." Hi.
So why couldn't they just pay the people to go there if they needed labor?
Well, because they could get it for free. So why pay them if you didn't have to pay? Yeah, they could get this free labor, and you could just grab them. You put them in Newgate jail, and then you ship them all at once. It was just miserably efficient. It was just horrible. Are there any other questions? Well, I'll just end by. Yeah, thank you. I'll just end with one quick writer's story on why writers write, because God knows when you write nonfiction, it's not for the big bucks. You do it because you love it, and it's a labor of love, and I loved every minute of researching and writing the Tin Ticket. But this is one of the best moments about why writers write. So I was staying with descendants of Ludlow in Melbourne, and I had booked a talk with an independent bookstore that was one of the first in Australia to get my book in, and they said they're happy to have me. And so I was thrilled. And one of the descendants got a call saying, we had to move Deborah's talk to the church down the street because 150 people signed up and it won't fit in our store. I'm like, okay, fine. And I walked in, and beautiful church, and the bookstore owner said, "Oh, I have a surprise for you." And I thought it was just the beautiful spread, like the food here, the beautiful desserts spread out by all the church ladies. And she said, "I didn't know this when I booked this hall, but the assistant minister is going to introduce you tonight. Her name is Clemence Taplin, and she's a direct descendant of Elizabeth Gurney Fry." I know. Again, and I have to give a talk, but the best part of this story is I got to see some family artifacts, and after my talk, descendants of Ludlow went over to Clemence Taplin and said, "I'd like to thank your great-great-great-grandma for helping my great-great-grandma." That's why writers write. Thank you. And I have love tokens to show you if anyone wants to see them.